A deserted city. One human being left after germ warfare. He must defend himself against a group of demented survivors.
In August 1971, a post-apocalyptic film arrived in theaters that felt like nothing else playing that summer. Charlton Heston, A Deserted Los Angeles, and a story about the last man on Earth. Most people have no idea what went on behind the camera. These are The Omega Man, 1971, 15 Secrets Hidden for Decades. Secret 15, the scene that wasn't in the original script, and the ending that was changed. The ending of The Omega Man, Neville dying in a fountain, arms outstretched, blood draining into the water in an unmistakable echo of the crucifixion, was not part of the original screenplay. Charlton Heston confirmed this in his autobiography, In the Arena, noting that the crucifixion imagery was not written into the script at the outset. It was a decision made during production, after someone on the creative team felt the visual parallel fit the story's themes. It stayed in, and it became the film's most enduring image. But the ending that audiences saw was also shaped by a key scripted alteration that quietly changed the film's final statement. In an alternate version of the scene in which Richie tells Neville he should either kill or cure the family, the conversation takes place on the rooftop, where Neville has a large water tank and a .50 caliber machine gun positioned. The rooftop version gave the scene a different physical dynamic and a harder edge that fit Neville's military character more directly. The version that was used moved the scene inside Neville's apartment, softening the encounter and shifting its emotional register. The rooftop version was filmed but set aside, and it has never appeared in any standard release of the film. What both versions shared was the same trajectory toward Neville's death. There was never a version of this script in which he survived. The filmmakers committed to his death from the beginning, which set the Omega Man apart from the blockbuster instinct of the era to leave heroes standing. The decision to layer the Christ imagery over that already committed ending was the final touch, added late and quietly, that transformed a downbeat action conclusion into something considerably more deliberate. Secret 14. Heston read the novel on a plane, not knowing it had already been filmed. Charlton Heston's path to the Omega Man began on an airplane. He had picked up Richard Matheson's novel I Am Legend during a flight back to Los Angeles and read it through in one sitting. By the time he landed, he was convinced it should be made into a film, a modern adaptation that reflected the anxieties of the early 1970s rather than the 1950s science fiction conventions of an earlier era. He brought his enthusiasm to Warner Brothers and pushed for the project. What Heston did not know at the time, and only discovered later, was that the novel had already been adapted once, 7 years earlier, as The Last Man on Earth in 1964, starring Vincent Price. The film had been an American-Italian co-production that Matheson himself had been involved in writing, before the screenplay was so heavily revised by the producer that Matheson demanded a pseudonym on the credit. Heston's ignorance of the Price film was not unusual. The Last Man on Earth had received limited distribution and had not made a significant impression on American audiences. But it meant that his pitch to Warner Brothers was made in complete unawareness that the same source material had already been put on screen. Secret 13, Richard Matheson, thought the film was so removed from his book that it barely bothered him. Richard Matheson, the author of I Am Legend, had a complicated relationship with the various adaptations of his novel. His experience with The Last Man on Earth in 1964 had been painful. The screenplay revisions were significant enough that he wanted his name removed from the credit, replaced by the pseudonym Logan Swanson. He had invested creative effort and then watched the work transformed beyond recognition. By the time The Omega Man arrived in 1971, Matheson had recalibrated his expectations. He later said, with notable directness, that the film was so removed from his book that it did not even bother him. The novel's central irony, that Neville ultimately discovers the infected survivors have built a functioning society and that he, the last human, is the monster in their mythology, was almost entirely absent from the film. The vampiric biology of the novel had been replaced by a photosensitive cult of technophobic albinos. The film's title did not even reference the book's title. What Matheson had written was a quiet, disturbing meditation on isolation and identity. What reached the screen in 1971 was an action film with messianic imagery. He did not object loudly to what they had done because, by his own account, he barely recognized it as his work. Secret 12. The empty Los Angeles streets were shot on Sunday mornings, and people still got in. One of the most immediately striking things about the Omega Man is the sight of a completely deserted Los Angeles. Wide boulevards, empty intersections, abandoned storefronts, no pedestrians, no moving vehicles. In 1971, without CGI or digital erasure, that image had to be captured practically. The production solution was simple and effective. They filmed in the central business district of Los Angeles on early Sunday mornings, when downtown was naturally quiet. Principal photography began in late 1970, when the business district on weekends was genuinely sparse. The director Boris Sagal used helicopter shots looking down over the empty grid of streets, alongside ground-level footage captured in those early weekend hours. A third technique involved still photographs in which human figures and vehicles were essentially removed. The combination of approaches gave the film's opening passages a quality of emptiness that was real rather than manufactured. Actual Los Angeles, actually empty, captured by a crew that got up early enough to find it that way. The effect worked well enough to be genuinely unsettling, and it influenced later filmmakers. Director Danny Boyle would use the same Sunday morning technique when shooting the empty London streets for 28 Days Later in 2002. However, despite careful planning, the production was not entirely successful in eliminating all human presence. Bystanders appear in the background of some exterior shots, visible if you look closely, and moving cars briefly enter the frame in others. The crew could not close the streets entirely, and anyone who wandered through during filming became an unintentional extra in the apocalypse. Those continuity mistakes have remained in every release of the film. Secret 11. The opening music was changed for home video due to rights issues. The theatrical version of the Omega Man opened with Charlton Heston driving through those empty Los Angeles streets, while Frank Sinatra's recording of Strangers in the Night played on the car's 8-track player. The choice was deliberate and tonally sharp. Sinatra's voice, so firmly rooted in a world of supper clubs and occupied cities, playing in a world that was entirely vacant. The contrast between the music's social warmth and the absolute emptiness of the streets around Neville carried its own kind of melancholy. When the film was transferred to home video, the rights to use Sinatra's recording could not be secured, and the song was replaced with a different piece of music. Percy Faith's A Summer Place, a different era's romantic theme that produced a different but similarly displaced quality. Viewers who saw the film in theaters in 1971 heard Sinatra. Viewers who encountered it on VHS, DVD, or any subsequent home release heard something else. The theatrical version's opening, as it actually existed in theaters, has not been replicated in any home release. The Sinatra version is what the filmmakers intended, and it is what most people who saw it in 1971 actually heard. Secret 10. The score was written by the composer of the Doctor Who theme. The film's score was composed by Ron Grainer, an Australian-born composer who was, at the time, one of the most recognizable names in British television music. Grainer had written the theme for Doctor Who in 1963, the theme for The Prisoner in 1967, and the theme for Steptoe and Son. He had become a significant figure in both British television and European film scoring, and his hiring for the Omega Man brought a specific sensibility to a project that leaned hard into early 1970s production aesthetics. His score for the film was not universally embraced. The music is full-throated, occasionally percussive, and pitched in a register that some critics felt was too bright and energetic for the film's apocalyptic setting, more in tune with the action sequences than with the existential weight Seagal was reaching for in the quieter passages. Others found it memorable and effective, particularly the more elegiac moments. Grainer used an assortment of instruments outside the traditional orchestral palette to generate a sonic texture that felt contemporary for 1971. A soundtrack album was not released at the time of the film's distribution, something that frustrated enthusiasts of the score for decades. Film Score Monthly eventually released it twice in subsequent years. Secret 9. The film was designed as part of Charlton Heston's unofficial science fiction trilogy. The Omega Man was not an isolated project in Charlton Heston's filmography. It was the middle installment of what critics and Heston himself came to recognize as a loose trilogy of science fiction films he made in the early 1970s, each of which placed him as a cynical, sardonic man at the edge of civilization, confronting a world that had collapsed or been distorted by human hubris. The first was Planet of the Apes in 1968, in which Heston's astronaut arrived in a future where apes had supplanted humans. The third was Soylent Green in 1973, in which he played a detective uncovering the truth behind a food source in an overpopulated future. All three films used genre science fiction conventions to engage with flashpoint social and political questions. Planet of the Apes with race and authority, The Omega Man with Cold War biological warfare and the counterculture, Soylent Green with environmental collapse and corporate power. Producer Walter Seltzer worked with Heston on both The Omega Man and Soylent Green, giving the latter two a production continuity. Together, the three films constitute one of the more sustained engagements with dystopian science fiction by a single star in the history of Hollywood. Secret 8. The Manson family murders directly influenced the design of the cult villain. Anthony Zerbe's Matthias, the former television newscaster who leads the photosensitive survivors in their technophobic crusade against Neville, was not created in a cultural vacuum. The film's writers, John William Corrington and Joyce Hooper Corrington, were working in the immediate aftermath of the Manson family murders, which had taken place in August 1969 in Los Angeles. The killings, carried out by a cult organized around a charismatic leader with apocalyptic beliefs, had created a specific and intensely local anxiety about the counterculture and the way its communal idealism could turn into something darker. Matthias and his family were a direct echo of that anxiety. A former establishment figure who had broken with modernity and now led a robed apocalyptic commune, technophobic, light-sensitive, committed to purifying the world of the machines and institutions that had destroyed it, bore obvious thematic resemblance to the world that Manson had created. The film placed that figure in Los Angeles, the same city where the Tate and LaBianca murders had happened, and made the connection between utopian commune and murderous cult as explicit as mainstream studio filmmaking of 1971 was willing to make it. Secret 7. Whoopi Goldberg was wrong about the kiss, but she believed it for 20 years. Whoopi Goldberg became a vocal advocate for the significance of the interracial kiss between Charlton Heston and Rosalind Cash in The Omega Man. She cited it publicly as one of the first, if not the first, interracial on-screen kiss in Hollywood cinema. When she hosted her network interview talk show in 1992, she invited Heston on as a guest specifically to discuss the scene and its cultural importance. Goldberg's belief was sincere, and her enthusiasm for the film was real, but the historical claim was not accurate. On-screen interracial kisses had appeared in Hollywood productions before 1971, including Island in the Sun in 1957, A Patch of Blue in 1965, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in 1967. What the scene in The Omega Man did carry was a specific quality of naturalism and matter-of-factness that made it unusual for its era. Heston wrote in his autobiography that Rosalind Cash, for whom the film represented her first significant leading role, had been understandably nervous about the scene, describing her feelings about performing a love scene with Heston in distinctly frank terms. The scene itself played without fanfare, which was arguably more progressive than the films that had preceded it and treated similar scenes as events requiring commentary. Secret 6. The crucifixion scene was not in the original script. Charlton Heston addressed this directly in his autobiography, In the Arena. The death scene that closes The Omega Man, Neville falling into the fountain, arms spread, blood diffusing into the water as Dutch and the survivors look on, was not written into the original screenplay. The visual parallel to Christ's crucifixion was a decision reached during production by people who felt the imagery fit the narrative's already existing themes of sacrifice and self-immolation for the salvation of others. Neville, immune by accident rather than design, becomes the source of the cure that may save what remains of humanity. His blood, specifically, is the medium of that salvation. The decision to stage his death in a pose that made the blood as salvation imagery as explicit as possible was bold for a mainstream studio picture, and it was made without being written into the script first. Once the idea was on the table, it was felt to be too right to leave out. The fountain shot replaced what would have been a more conventional action death, and it gave the film its most discussed and replicated image. Secret 5. The film directly inspired Joel Hodgson to create Mystery Science Theater 3000. One specific scene in The Omega Man had a cultural afterlife that nobody involved in the production could have anticipated. The scene in which Neville, completely alone in Los Angeles, sits in an abandoned movie theater and watches Woodstock, a fellow Warner Brothers film, while making sardonic commentary on the screen, planted an idea in the mind of a television writer and comedian named Joel Hodgson. Hodgson later identified that scene as the direct inspiration for Mystery Science Theater 3000, the long-running comedy series in which a man trapped in space was forced to watch bad movies and survive by making jokes at the screen. The concept of a lone person in a theater talking back to the film, using wit as a tool of psychological survival, came directly from watching Heston in The Omega Man. The show premiered in 1988, ran in various forms for decades, and developed one of the most dedicated cult followings in American television. Its foundational creative idea had been sitting in The Omega Man since 1971. Secret 4. The Police wrote a song about the film in 1981. A decade after The Omega Man opened in theaters, the British rock band The Police released their album Ghost in the Machine in 1981. The album contained a track written by guitarist Andy Summers called Omega Man, stylized, like the film's title, with the Greek letter Omega. The song was directly based on the film. The Police were, by 1981, one of the most commercially successful rock bands in the world, with a string of hit albums and singles that had defined the post-punk and new wave moment. Summers' decision to write a song rooted in a decade-old science fiction film about biological apocalypse and social collapse reflected the film's persistence in the cultural imagination of people who had seen it in their youth. Ghost in the Machine also generated the top 10 hit Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic that same year. Omega Man was not the album's commercial centerpiece, but its existence on one of the most successful rock albums of 1981 represented an unusual kind of tribute to a studio film that had received mixed reviews at its initial release. Secret 3. The Simpsons parodied it, and so did Strange Brew and others. The Omega Man had a specific kind of cultural footprint. It was not celebrated as a prestige film, but it was everywhere in the cultural water table of people who grew up in the 1970s and 1980s watching genre cinema. The parodies and references accumulated steadily over the decades. The Simpsons dedicated the first short in its 1997 Treehouse of Horror 8 Halloween special, titled The H Omega Mega Man, to a direct parody of the film, placing Homer in Heston's role as Springfield was annihilated. The Canadian comedy film Strange Brew from 1983, starring Bob and Doug McKenzie, opens with a direct reference to Heston in the film. The film Night of the Comet in 1984 has been described by critics as a satirical remake substituting two high school girls for Heston. Tim Burton, in interviews for his 2009 Museum of Modern Art retrospective and with the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, named The Omega Man as the film he would choose on a desert island, and said that no matter how many times he had seen it, he could not walk past it on television without stopping. The film's influence on his own sensibility, the lonely outsider, the ironic one-liner in the face of disaster, was visible in his work for decades. Secret 2. The director Boris Sagal died in a tragic accident a decade later. Boris Sagal directed The Omega Man in 1971. He had built his career primarily in television. He was not a major theatrical filmmaker, and his work on The Omega Man represented his largest-scale studio production. In the years that followed, he continued working in television and directed the well-regarded 1983 television miniseries World War III. In May 1981, Sagal died in an accident on the set of the miniseries World War III in Oregon. He walked into the tail rotor of a helicopter while filming and was killed. He was 58 years old. The circumstances of his death were a grim coincidence for a director who had built much of his career around stories of global catastrophe and human survival under extreme conditions. His daughter, Katie Sagal, went on to become one of the most recognizable faces in American television, with long-running roles in Married, With Children, and Sons of Anarchy. The Sagal name became better known in popular culture through her career than through her father's work, which is its own kind of irony for a director who had made a film that outlasted most of its contemporaries. Secret 1. The film was a bigger box office success than its critical reception suggested. When The Omega Man opened in August 1971, it received the kind of reviews that might have killed a less commercially tenacious film. Roger Ebert awarded it 2 stars and found the mutants a little too ridiculous. Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune gave it 1 star. Howard Thompson at the New York Times called the climax florid and phony. Rotten Tomatoes, compiling retrospective critical opinion, settled on a 65% average from 34 critics, which, in the context of early 1970s, science fiction was not a disaster, but was hardly a triumph. The film earned $4 million in theatrical rentals in the United States and Canada, on a budget that, while not publicly confirmed in full, was modest by major studio standards. It grossed $29,900 in its opening week from its initial 3-theater run in Houston, expanded to wider release shortly after, and performed well enough to make a profit and establish the kind of steady theatrical life that brought it to television, where it found the audience that eventually made it a cult film. That television audience, kids watching it on weekend afternoons, teenagers staying up late to catch it, is the audience that turned it into a reference point for everyone from Joel Hodgson to Tim Burton to Andy Summers. The critics who dismissed it in 1971 were writing for the present. The film had already begun accumulating its future. The Omega Man was shot on empty Sunday morning streets, built around a script that quietly added its most famous image late in production, based on a novel whose author could barely recognize it as his own work, and released to mixed reviews that it has spent 50 years outlasting. The ending was never going to be happy. The crucifixion pose was never in the original script. The opening music was changed before most people ever owned a VCR. And the scene of a man watching a movie alone in an empty theater became the foundation for one of television's most beloved comedy concepts. If this one was worth your time, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another look behind the screen at the stories that shaped what we watched.